Now won't you all give a warm welcome to Mayor Greg Fischer as he comes from Louisville to Pittsburgh. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. How's the energy in the room? Man, no break. It's tough. Hey, before I start, I want to tell you guys, you know what I think, but you have a fantastic mayor in Bill Peduto. He has been mayor for about 3 years, well respected around the country, so don't take him for granted and support him with each and everything he does. So good job, Bill. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a compassionate city here today, which some people think is a little unusual for an elected official to talk about. But the way all this came about was when I first spoke to the city as mayor, it should be the most powerful words that I have to say. So this is a cold winter morning in January of 2011. And so, of course, I thought, what do I want to say the first time that I'm mayor? And I could have talked about important things like education, public safety. But I said, no, I want to step this up another level. And I want to really talk about what are the most important things that a city should be thinking about. And that is to convey the values that would guide the decision-making of my administration for as long as we've served in office. And these values are, our city of lifelong learning, an even healthier city, and an even more compassionate city. People thought compassion was a little weird, to be honest with you. They're like, boy, that sounds kind of weak. But in fact, as you'll hear throughout this presentation, it actually takes strength to be a city of compassion. So to be a great mayor, in my view, and you've got one here, as I said, you need the head of a chief executive officer and the heart of a social worker. Because the real job of leading a city isn't just cutting ribbons or managing a budget, it's to affect massive political, cultural change and deliver results in a city around major issues like equity, education, and health. And mayors, there's no question we have the public's attention. So we can affect the conversations that take place in our cities to maximize the good, every opportunity that we have. And we can, if we devote ourselves to it, affect cultural change on a big scale in our cities. And that's what my team and I have been working to do. And our vehicle for that is compassion. So let me tell you first how we define compassion. A lot of people think compassion is empathy. No, compassion is an action word. Compassion means respect for each and every one of our citizens so that their full human potential is thriving, flourishing. Imagine in your city if everybody was walking around with their human potential flourishing and thriving. So it's action. It's not weak. Anybody can be a critic from the couch. It's another thing to get up and respect and love your fellow human beings so that you want their full human potential to be actualized. Now, it's part of our culture. Thomas Merton, one of the 4 individuals mentioned by the Pope when he visited America some 6 months or so ago, Louisville is his hometown. He was in the Abbey of Gethsemane, just on the edge of Louisville, so he's part of our culture. And one of Thomas Merton's key messages is the interdependence and interconnectedness that we all have as human beings. We know that intuitively. Why don't we act like that? And Thomas Merton's epiphany was in the year 1958 at 4th and Walnut Street. It's now known as 4th and Muhammad Ali Streets in Louisville, and it was a hustling, bustling shopping district in our city. And he had an epiphany. I love the fact that he had an epiphany at 4th and Walnut Street in Louisville. If you're going to have an epiphany, why not have it in the middle of downtown Louisville? He looked at the people, and he saw them all walking around, he said, shining like the sun. And he said, if only we could all see each other that way, there would be no more war, no more hatred, no more violence. So imagine a city. Imagine your city of Pittsburgh, where you see people walking around shining like the sun. And what that potential and what that common humanity suggests to all of us, the unused potential that's currently left unused. Why is all this work important? I would suggest it's more important than ever. Every city, and we see this playing out live and in color on our TV screens right now across the country with the riots taking place in our cities. We need to build social muscle in our cities to counter the type of unrest that we see. No one disagrees with our notion of compassion. The question is, how do you bring compassion alive in a city? The easiest way to do that is through volunteer work. So one of the things we started immediately was to have this give-a-day week of volunteership. Easy for people to do, understandable, but the fact is, as we talked to many of the people that participate in this, they didn't know how to engage. So don't underestimate your all's building of on-ramps for people to engage, whether it be as volunteers, whether it be in discussions about health, whatever. Our first year in 2011, we had 800 volunteers. This past April, we had 175,000 volunteers in acts of compassion in our city. 175,000. My goal? 770,000. Why? That's the number of citizens that we have in Louisville. Certainly everybody can have an act of compassion during a week. And during this week, we intentionally put different groups of people together that normally don't see each other. So they can see that guy across the city, that guy, that other, whomever that is actually a University of Louisville Cardinal fan just like they are. And it's that simple breaking down of that barrier that so often leads to possibilities. We also use compassion in our jail. Did you know that a corrections officer has the shortest lifespan of any profession because of the constant stress of being a corrections officer in a jail? So we've trained our corrections staff on mindfulness and meditation techniques so they can calm down and take the bigger picture. Within the jail itself, our most frequent users of the jail, as we look at the data, and I'm sure it's the same here in Pittsburgh as well, have an addiction problem of alcohol or drugs and some sort of mental illness. It costs $80,000 a year to house someone in that condition who's done no real harmful crime. Isn't it smarter to have transitional housing, 24/7 counseling, and by the way, at a cost of $30,000 a year? That's not just compassion, and that's not just the right moral thing to do. It's good for business. We also, as a city, are in charge of the animal services. How do you be more compassionate to animals? And yes, we have doubled our live release rate in the community. People can drop off any kind of animal at our animal services. So we're faced with an existential question when a pig gets dropped off. What will happen with this pig's life? We make a compassionate choice. We find him a good home at a vegan farm. That's what a compassionate city does. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about compassion in the context of racial equity. And remember, we define compassion as just respecting the full human potential. Boy, think about the backdrop that we're under right now. This presidential election that we're undergoing right now is putting unprecedented questions about religion, gender, and race front and center for us all to talk about at our dinner tables and beyond. And so compassion naturally has to be part of that answer. It's just not the nice thing to do, it's a smart thing to do. Because when you demonstrate compassion for your citizens, it sends the key message, and we're hearing it from everybody today. Everybody has to be along for the ride. Everybody has to have the capacity to contribute. And we know that's important. And right now we also know that that just is not the case, whether it be here in Pittsburgh, whether it be in Louisville, cities all over the country. And that's why we're seeing the riots in the streets of America. And think about that kind of mind-jarring statement. Regular riots in the streets of America. It's been a long time since we've seen that. If that can't wake up the country, what will? And of course, in my view, what we see on the streets is, yes, it's an officer-involved shooting that's typically the catalyst, but what we're seeing from the street is rage about hopelessness and disconnectedness, people not feeling like they have a pathway to a hopeful future in this globally competitive world, this new global economy that we have. Everybody's very familiar with the top 1% and how this gap has grown to unsustainable proportions. We know that people of color have been historically left behind, but it's not just minorities. So interesting in this presidential cycle that we see right now, and don't mean to stereotype, but we see angry, rural, white, undereducated voters who are a big part of Donald Trump's supporters. Well, in fact, they feel disconnected, hopeless, left behind. This generation, not maybe the past 10, 20 generations like of our communities of color, but I think there's an opportunity here where the deep urban Hillary supporters and the rural white Trump voters, maybe once this nonsense is over on November the 8th, I'm optimistic we can come together so that everyone can be along for the ride. So we need to balance capitalism with social progress. Capitalism is good. It's just got out of balance. And racial equity is obviously critical to that. I see encouraging signs. Certainly the conversation and actions that will come out of this conference. In our city, our Black Lives Matter movement now probably has more Caucasian people in it than African Americans because of some of the basic, obvious roots of injustice that have occurred for centuries in our country. Cities are the labs for our society, and it's important that we lean in to these issues, and you all clearly are doing that here in our city. And there's a broad recognition for change in our country. The White House's recent report on 21st century policing addresses many of these issues. And their first pillar is called Building Trust and Legitimacy between the police departments and communities of color around America. Big news yesterday. The big chiefs, the chiefs of the big cities are meeting in San Diego for their annual meeting. Yesterday at their annual meeting, the U.S. police chiefs issued an apology for historic mistreatment of minorities in our country. And I will say, this is a difficult path for many of our majority community, our Caucasian community, to go down. But the importance of a conference like this and further conversations is it gets people to think. How else can you explain a movement that's relatively young, like Black Lives Matter? 2 years later in my city, half of the movement are white people. Minds are being opened up, and I see that all the time in my community. And we understand that police-community relations are not an either or. It's not about a black life or a blue life or a brown life. We're all in this together. We are imperfect people on an imperfect journey. But if we are pursuing noble goals like compassion, it'll work out just fine. We've addressed this issue by creating our Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, by having strong police-community relationships, by a focus on preventing violent crime, homicides, suicides, overdoses, leaning in as a strong national partner on My Brother's Keeper, President Obama's movement, our Black Male Achievement activities, Cities United, Rumble Young Man Rumble. And we're proud to be one of the 5 cities selected for the racial equity cohort here to study race and moving forward with a national discussion and actions around race and historic mistreatment. So, a salient question would be, how do we create positive change and make measurable progress in traditionally disadvantaged communities? And we know the long-term pathway forward to progress on most anything has its roots in the classroom. So for our education priorities for our cities, we've got to re-examine how we raise our kids. Far too often, our society has just looked at this education rubric that we're very familiar with, getting somebody ready for kindergarten, 3rd grade reading levels. That model really hasn't changed in the last 50 to 100 years. Think how our institutions have changed. Breakdowns in families, houses of worship, neighborhoods. Some of the strong institutions that have created the values, the human values, that has been the glue for many of our societies for millennia. So we've seen this breakdown. We understand education milestones. We now, as a country and cities, have to broaden our aspect of raising our students, raising our kids through the classroom. We've got to focus on mental and social, emotional health and development. Those milestones should be as obvious with common language to us as our education milestones is. And we need to build structures into our education system to help kids develop on this path. In Louisville, we're addressing this whole child approach by working with the Harvard Graduate School of Education on their By All Means program, and also working with the Say Yes Foundation. So the whole child is being raised. And by that, I mean the intellectual child, the mental and physical health needs of that child, the resilience that child needs. Think no further than most of the kids and grandkids of you all here in this room, where you identify what they need. When there's a gap, you know how to get it for them. If you have been raised in a traditionally disadvantaged community, multiple generations of neglect, you don't have those tools. But their kids are showing up next to your kids in kindergarten 3 years behind. How do they catch up? The fact is, the sad fact in today's society, most kids do not catch up. But we pay for it for years and years to come after that. So I would encourage you to fundamentally rethink how we raise that whole child. This is one of our methods for doing it. We call it our Compassionate Schools Project. It's a partnership between the City of Louisville, Jefferson County Public Schools. We have 100,000 students in there, and the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education. Last year was our pilot year in 3 schools. This year we're in 26 schools. We focus on the social and emotional development and coping skills of our kids. The lack of these coping skills is what leads to violence on most of our streets. We focus on nutrition and wellness so we can take care of our bodies and fight this obesity epidemic in our country. And of course, we focus on the mind through mindfulness and breathing exercises. In our most distressed communities, our youngest citizens are showing up for kindergarten from living full-time in a post-traumatic stress society. Their brains have not developed normally. They don't know what it is to have an open mind and an open heart for learning and for empathy. And that is the result of our Compassionate Schools Project. It opens the heart and it opens the mind so our kids can begin to learn. Are there benefits to compassion? I'm a business guy. I'm an entrepreneur, so we got to have results from this as well. Louisville has been named an International Model City of Compassion for 4 years in a row. When we were competing for a large business services company with Nashville, Louisville and Nashville are always competing. We ended up winning this large company, 1,500 employees. I asked their CEO, why Louisville? We narrowed it down from 40 cities to 2, and we won. He looked at me and he said, I loved your city's focus on compassion. So compassion is good for business. It's also good as we build the international aspect of our community. Half of our population growth is coming from foreign-born citizens that we welcome to our community. I believe our cities and our country will be the model for the rest of the world in terms of bringing diversity and pluralism together and building great 21st century cities and countries. And compassion was seen really close up when you ask, is it working? It was seen close up by the world during the week that we celebrated the passing of our most famous Louisvillian, and that is Muhammad Ali. During the Ali week, the world focused its attention on our city. And normally when we're gripped on the TV screens, it's around some type of tragedy. But in the focus on our city, what the world saw was the focus on a man of compassion, a city of compassion, and a city of love. And Muhammad Ali certainly belonged to the world, but he only had one hometown. And I'm proud to say that's our town. And he was much more than the world's greatest athlete of the 20th century. He was also the world's greatest humanitarian. Think about all of our celebrities and all of our athletes, if they used their platforms to spread this message of compassion and love and kindness. In our city and the world came together like never before. 2,500 people from the global media, hundreds of thousands of people in our city saying goodbye to the champ. Our job was to send him off with dignity and respect. our city's social muscles were ready from all the work that we had done around compassion. And we quickly organized events like I Am Ali, where 15,000 kids showed up and said, I am Ali. I have the greatness within me. In 48 hours, that was put together. We wanted to show the world that a city in the South could love a proud, strong black man and a Muslim. Think about that during the Ali week. Yes, he was a supernatural character. But how often do we put on stage for the world to say, he's our man, proud black man, a Muslim. So he was our neighbor, our brother, our uncle. And Ali is part of our city's compassion heritage. Compassion really is part of our culture. We're the first city in the South to pass an open housing ordinance, a fairness ordinance. We're the home of Ali, as I've mentioned, Thomas Merton. And we also have a special partnership with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And think about what he's put up with throughout his life. We all need courage to step up and talk about these human values of kindness, compassion, and love. We're all born with it. We see that when a little baby is born and starts crawling. What does he or she do? They're looking for a hug. They're not coming up and slapping you on the side of the face and say, I'm mean and angry and divisive. They just want some love. And that's the type of courage that we as mayors and community leaders need to show. The kind of leadership that the Dalai Lama, Merton, Ali, Abraham Lincoln all showed us. They believed in higher ground and fearlessly leading people to it as well. And you have that in you too. That uncomfortable conversation that you want to have, that you know is right, but for some reason you're not quite ready to say it. I see that in the talk of Pittsburgh, where I've been here the past 2 days. Talk about equity, talk about inclusion, talk about raising everyone up. And that's why I was excited to come and speak here at the invitation of Mayor Peduto and the Heinz Foundation. That's what brought all of you here today. Look, we've got a lot of strife in our country right now. Human values and culture around kindness, compassion, and love must be critical to our local, national, and international dialogue. Not just as some kind of soft, boy, wouldn't this be nice, but exploring that interconnectedness that we have as a human race, not as a black race or a brown race or a Muslim or Christian race, the human race, the original race that pulls us all together. And so all we need is for more of us to lean into this, to have this kind of conversation, to expand your comfort zone and then do something about it, right? And whether you're elected or not, we all have a pulpit. I've got a public pulpit. You've got public pulpits. How do you use those pulpits? How do you use the pulpit at your dinner table? How do you use the pulpit in your church to move us forward towards some good? All have social media pulpits. Use it to communicate your own vision around compassion and kindness and love. I am really optimistic about our country. I think we're at the climax of a culture war taking place right now in this presidential election. And I think we're going to come out of that just fine. And then we have some rebuilding work to do. But we will say, we got that out of our system, and it was ugly. Now, we can't act like it's just going to go away. We've got to rebuild this country that we are. But we've had the conversation, and we see a positive, hope-filled, unified vision forward. I'm optimistic because I see that in your city. I see it in my city. All the mayors of the country will tell you all the great things that are going on in our city. We can't get distracted by this media-driven narrative that says America is going to hell in a handbasket. That is not true. There is hope and optimism in our cities, and that is the result for our country as well. So really, folks, it is quite simple. And I want to close with a quote from his Dalai Lama. If you're ever scratching your head and said, this is too big, I don't know what to do, just think about this. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Thanks, everybody.